Okay, thank you for coming to the Xanadu Review. My name is Pressure John's Revenge, but you can call me PJ. Well, today with us I have James Benson Sarsgard, and he writes the blog on Substack, The Garden of Shenadar. And James is kind of one of my favorite, I think, kind of underrated writers on Substack. He does some really cool stuff about history, labor politics. He's kind of all over the place, does some interesting stuff. But James, do you want to jump in a little bit, tell the audience a little bit about yourself, the type of stuff you write, etc.?
Yeah, I guess I'll do the little blurb. I'm a Gen Xer, since that seems to be a thing these days to say your generation. Um, I'm a carpenter by trade, writer by passion, I guess you'd say. I started writing on Substack probably about a year ago, and just sort of found a lot of interesting people on there like PJ, and I've sort of, I guess, started to carve out a niche for writing a little bit more about prehistory and just sort of like the human experience, how that relates to who we are now and where we may have come from in the deep past is something that's really interesting to me. So I focus on that a lot. But I also write about, I write a little bit about modern culture stuff and subcultures that I've sort of been around and a part of in my life.
Yeah, well, it's really good stuff. So that's kind of what the history thing is kind of what we bonded over. There's a good chunk of people who write really interesting stuff on history. And I kind of like to get into that a little bit myself, but it's just part of what I respect so much about what you do. It sounds like you actually do a lot of great research, and I just like read random books and watch random documentaries and kind of get an idea in my head. Um, but I guess my first question for you is, since you're a history buff as well, what originally made you interested in history as a subject or a concept? Was it, an early love of childhood, or did you find it later on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I've always been interested in history. When I was in high school, I had a really good history teacher, but that was more like U.S. history and the Middle Ages, that kind of stuff. That was what I was focused on in high school in that age. And I was interested in writing and reading a lot at that point, but I didn't really go into prehistory much until a lot more recently, which is sort of like now. I mean, I'm still very interested in recorded history, and there's lots of periods that I feel like I want to try to focus on more and learn more about. But probably around the last 10 years, probably I had a kid around then, and I think that really kind of jump started my curiosity to learn more about like what the human story is going really deep in the past. And interestingly, that sort of coincided with like the mid-teens ancient DNA revolution that was happening around that time. There was just so many really interesting, exciting papers coming out about how ancient DNA was kind of finding these connections in prehistoric populations, and ways that we really weren't able to peer into the prehistory had become a lot more easy to do so in the last 10 years. So I kind of feel like it was fortuitous that I developed an interest in that particular facet of it at the time that I did. And I feel like it's just a really interesting time for that right now. But I purely do it as like an amateur out of a love of the subject. So
Mhm. Yeah, kind of the same here. I think if I had to guess what got me into it, it's maybe a little bit silly, but I grew up very, very religious. Um, so the Bible in some ways, like, the historical accuracy of it is debated, but they do talk about like actual ancient civilizations, and for me, I was like, oh wow, the Egyptians were real, the Assyrians were real, the Greeks are real. When I was a very, very little kid, I think that inspired me from a pretty young age. So I guess that's probably why for me my favorite era of history is the Bronze Age.
yeah,
Just any of those really ancient civilizations, which actually I think it connects pretty well to the prehistory stuff, because it's so long in the past. It was closer to the prehistory than what
right.
we where we are right now.
Yeah.
So what would you say your favorite era of history is, if you have to pick? Or do you have like, are you a Romans guy? Are you a Egyptians guy?
Can I go into prehistory or just recorded history?
Either or, whatever really strikes your fancy, I guess.
I think for me, like my main like sort of obsession at this point is the Neolithic period of Eurasia. There's just so much going on in that period that I really feel like was central to not just the history of Europeans and Asians, but the world through the ripple effects of like what happened later. But specifically like the expansion of farming into Europe, I've written about on my blog. I find that to be really interesting, and that happened like uh, around 8,000 years ago, and then into the Indo-European expansions throughout Eurasia, which that story is just endlessly fascinating to me. And I've done a lot of like reading and research about that period. In terms of like recorded history, and I've always been really fascinated by the Aztecs and a lot of the Mesoamerican civilizations when they came into contact with the Europeans. That's like an incredibly dark story in a lot of ways, but super fascinating, the clash of cultures, the way that happened. So
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something I wrote about too, kind of using the fall of the Aztec Empire as a framing device for kind of looking at things in the modern day, because a lot of people don't know, at least in my experience, that there's this myth that's, I mean, I feel like very chauvinistic, Eurocentric, of like, oh, Cortez and his 400 conquistadors were able to take out the whole Aztec Empire,
mhm.
which kind of looped around and ended up biting them in the butt because they had the all these other nations and tribes that were just hated the Aztecs so much that they
Yeah.
united with the conquistadors.
Yeah, I thought that piece you wrote was really interesting from that perspective. Like the Tlaxcalans, the people who
Hmm.
the Aztecs just treated them pretty badly. So they had very little incentive to not play ball with Cortez. I mean, I'm sure
Hmm.
there's a lot of historians who would kind of debate some of the particulars of how that exchange went down. But from what I've read, it seems like they were ready to just be like, hey, man, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Hmm.
And I feel like that's something that's probably happened a lot of times in both prehistory and history. And it is sort of a good, like you pointed out in that article, it's a good sort of like, I guess you could say, a teaching moment, for us to
Hmm.
study that and be like, okay, this has happened in the past. When you get divisions between people, they're easily exploited.
Yeah, well, it's in that case specifically, it makes me think that, well, I mean, obviously, like, how could they have known that the extent of what was going to happen, as far as they knew, like, oh, these are just, another tribe from farther away. They didn't know the extent of what was going to happen with colonialism. But I think you're right. There are many cases, I think, of like, one of the big pop history topics, and I know we'll get into pop history in a little bit, is Genghis Khan, um, or Hannibal, I think is maybe a
Mm,
better example, who kind of similar. Like there was just so much resentment against the Romans at the time that he
right.
was able to get so many people to just flip and turn on them. And obviously being a great general, but still, like if there's dissent and disunity in the homeland, that's something that can pretty easily be turned against an imperial power.
It helps when you have an army of elephants too, right?
That
That's
too. I
always,
mean,
yeah,
elephants and civil unrest. It's a
right.
recipe for disaster. Um, so I guess that kind of maybe loops into the one of the main things that I wanted to talk to you about, that we've kind of talked a little bit on the side. The whole thing with Graham Hancock and his, maybe less than reputable theories about prehistory. And it's something that I wanted to talk to you about specifically because I know you read a lot about like the prehistoric genetic side. And just for the audience who doesn't know, so Graham Hancock is he'll go out of his way to tell you he's not a historian because mainstream historians hate him. Right. So he's a journalist turned, I guess you could say, investigative reporter who had this theory because there were essentially that human society is much, much older than we think it is. And he thinks that there was some proto civilization that taught all these disparate civilizations all over the world um, to build pyramids and agriculture and other stuff like that. And it was a pre-ice age civilization, and there was some global cataclysm that I guess wiped everybody out, and they were these older prehistoric civilization kind of set the seeds of what we have now. And it's been pretty controversial in that those communities, since on one level you have accusations of racism because it is I don't personally see it in Graham Hancock's case, but with say the fingerprints of the gods, ancient alien things. There's some kind of inherent Eurocentrism that you could say that, oh, these prehistoric people who aren't European, they could have never figured it out, or just more mundane things like pretty bad methodology on his part. So I guess what are your thoughts on this? Because I know we've talked about it a little bit, particularly with the prehistory side, because I'm kind of like you. I do this as a hobby. I like to just read random books on history or documentaries, but it seems like he's kind of controversial and maybe sometimes giving. Yeah, he's definitely made waves. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been following him for a while now. I think I read Fingerprints of the Gods around 20 years ago. I was in my 20s when I read it. And that was I wrote about it in the piece that I just put out this week that talks about Hancock and hyperdiffusion. Hyperdiffusion being the theory that not just Hancock's theory, but the idea that when you see things that are that look similar in disparate parts of the world, that they could possibly have a connection in like an inheritance from some sort of ancient civilization or cultural horizon. So yeah, I in addressing that, I mentioned that I did read his book Fingerprints of the Gods, and it was probably one of the first books I ever read about prehistory. So it really actually kind of opened a door for me to become more curious about that. And in that sense, I think Hancock is a good cultural force, because in some ways I think he really has turned on people to study this field that might otherwise not have been interested in it. So I think that's a positive, and we could talk a little bit more about that later. But as far as his theories, yeah, I just don't feel like he has any evidence. I mean, it's like he has a lot of mythological conjecture. Like he weaves together these myths about floods and sort of makes this this case that like, hey, this Native American tribe has this creation story about a flood, and what about this thing over in Eurasia? And he kind of like does this comparative mythology thing, which I'd say that's fine if you can back it up with supporting evidence. Like I'm very interested in how myths relate, and I think there is something there. I think there's definitely a lot to talk about there. But with Hancock, I just feel like it's not that what he's doing is bad or wrong, but it's like, if you're going to say that, I always go back to the Carl Sagan quote that gets used a lot in this context, is like, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I just don't really feel like he has met the bar for that.
Yeah, what I'll say about just to jump into a little bit, I'll say two things about Graham Hancock that I would say. I see some people saying that he's just an unscrupulous grifter and he's just trying to make money. I get the impression this is genuinely what he believes, and he's genuinely passionate about it. And B, he's a much better entertainer and communicator than he is, I guess, a serious academic mind. And I say that, take that with a grain of salt, because I'm just some random guy on the internet. I don't have any background in this. I find it interesting and I love to read about it. But at the same time, kind of like you said, I watched, it was, I think, about a week ago. I'd never seen the first season. I watched the second one with my wife and my sister. And then on Friday, once again, my wife and my sister were hanging out. They were, I think, going somewhere else. I was like, this is a great time, because it's Joe Rogan, right? So I live in a state where weed is legal. I decided I'm gonna smoke a joint and I'm gonna watch Graham Hancock, and it is prime entertainment for that. You could not.
Hell yeah.
It just, the editing is great. He's great. I mean, because he's a journalist first, so he's so great at weaving a narrative. That having been said, kind of like you mentioned, the evidence that he has is very tenuous. And I think, because part of me, and I want to hear your take on the whole, pre-modern civilization thing, because to me, aspects of it seem plausible. Because I'm sure you know this, but for people in the audience who don't, there's many cases where mainstream historians did think that something from antiquity was just a myth. Like, for example, the city of Troy, they thought was mythological until I think like the mid 1800s. The the Indus Valley civilization.
Right.
There's many cases of this that they thought it was, this is not real, but after technology got a little bit better, they did a bit more research. they found, in fact, these were real things that the myths were based upon. So all that to say, like, I could see there being human civilization being older than we think it is. Because I think he and other people in that world have made good points that humans tend to build on the coasts, as well as we tend to build on the same spots. Like a prime piece of real estate now would probably be a prime piece of real estate 5,000 years ago. Like I know, I think it's I forget which city in Iraq, but it's been like continuous human civilization there for at least 5,000 years. So between that or the fact that, archaeology didn't start in the 1800s in Europe, there's a really interesting case that I know of that there are some archaeologists, European archaeologists who were doing an excavation of this Babylonian site. I think is a Babylonian or Assyrian, and it was a museum that they had thousands of years ago. So people have been doing this. This stuff has not just been sitting in stasis. So there's aspects of it that are plausible, but he goes several steps too far for me of like this megalithic civilization that I think we're psychic or something. Like he has these, these little things to fill in the gaps. Like, oh, there's no, record of them moving these stones because they would throat sing or something. I don't know.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts? Do you think that there's any merit to it whatsoever? Or, because I'm sure we'll get into this in a little bit. He debated a very kind of a unfortunately dispositioned man, Flint Dibble, with a very funny name, and they got into it and they just like kind of talked past each other. So what are your thoughts? Do you think there's any validity to it whatsoever?
Yeah, I guess I would say I think it's really important for us, especially in light of what's happened scientifically in the last couple decades, where there have been a lot of breakthroughs that have upended previously held theories. So I think it's really important to be open-minded. Like there's always a possibility that like what we know now about the past or think we know could be mostly or completely wrong. That's certainly always a possibility. But I think it's like, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not a scientist. I bang 2x4s together for a living. So like, take this with what it is. But to me, it always kind of comes back to like a few scientific concepts, like, the Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony, where it's like the more complicated your theory gets and the more extraneous things need to happen for it to work out, then, if you scrape that stuff away, the simpler answer is usually the right one. I think that holds here pretty well. And I think Graham just does a lot of confirmation bias too, where it's just sort of like, he always seems to be like working towards proving his theory and fitting the evidence into that rather than trying to disprove himself like a, quote unquote real scientist would. So I think those are like problems with just like, yeah, like you said, his methodology and the way he sort of goes about his theory. And I think it would be fine if, like you said, he was just like, hey, I'm a storyteller, because he is really good at that. Like he is a great storyteller and he's a good journalist in that sense. But I just kind of feel like his whole like me against the world, science is out to get me kind of thing is a little stale for me, and it doesn't really like he's building his case on the backs of like centuries of archaeological research. So it seems to me like you would want to be friends with those people and not enemies, to further prove the point. But I understand that like politics gets in there. So it does get really thorny, and the culture war stuff gets in there too. But I think, to answer your question, yes, I think it is certainly possible that maybe there was some civilization in the Ice Age that was much more sophisticated than we think. I guess my reading of the science at this point, and this is where I might, have some disagreement with people who, split hairs a little bit, but I just think like agriculture did not happen before Younger Dryas and the end of the Ice Age. I think like we have so much data now about domestication of animals associated with agriculture, the spread of humans associated with the first waves of that out of the Levant, and the crops themselves kind of have a molecular clock as to like when that process started, and it all points pretty clearly to what the archaeologists have been saying for a while now. So to me, that's a big problem with this theory, because he does seem to rely on like, hey,
Mhm.
they spread seeds across the world to these other people, and that just doesn't seem like it's gonna pan out to me.
So I only watched about, I think maybe a third to a half of the debate he did with Mr. Dibble on the Joe
Mhm.
Rogan Experience, because I just couldn't watch it. It was making me. It was
Yeah,
too aggravating because they were too. It was like nerd aggro, I guess you could
right.
say. But does he get into that? Because, and again, just to play devil's advocate, as somebody who has next to no knowledge about the aspects of historical pursuits that you're discussing, to play devil's advocate, it doesn't seem implausible to me if you're looking at pre-ice age civilization that having ice plains, or if they had been more closer to the coast,
Mhm.
and the water lines receded, that doesn't seem implausible to me. Or is that pretty much, does he address that at all, or is it just kind of a he
Yeah,
moves away from it?
they do address that, and I mean, as far as the debate, like I agree, it was painful. I actually am masochistic enough and nerdy enough that I watched the entire thing. So, you know, and I found Dibble to be maybe not the best messenger for it. Like he does know what he's talking about. He's certainly like a knowledgeable archaeologist, and I thought he did okay. But I feel like I've seen clips on YouTube after the fact where he's still just sort of like, "Hey, remember when I like destroyed Graham Hancock?" And it's just like, okay, come on, man. Like, are you a
Yeah,
scientist? You know,
he
like,
seems very, like like we said, Graham Hancock, love him or hate him, he's very charismatic. He's a great media personality. Mr. Flint Dibble, I know there's basically no chance that you're listening. I think you're great at what you do, but he's not particularly charismatic, and he seems like he really wants to be. He
yeah.
seems like he really wanted to be a media personality, but I just
But
don't think it
as
was
far as
there.
his presentation towards the end of that interview, he does give what I felt like was a pretty strong counter argument to Hancock, that Hancock didn't really have much for about agriculture, and about he showed plant samples of like wheat and what happens to wheat as it transitions from domestic to, or I'm sorry, from wild to domestic. And it was kind of interesting because he actually kind of catches Hancock at one point where he says, like Hancock's like, well, I never said that they spread agriculture. And he's like, actually, you did. It's in this page of Magicians of the Gods. And he shows him, and he's like, oh, okay. So, I
Mhm.
mean, it just seems to me like it's sort of like there's a lot of things that happen where he's like, sort of like, okay, well, now maybe they didn't have agriculture, but they had boats and they had this. And, it's like, sure, maybe like, and maybe they did have agriculture. And like you said, it just got buried by the rising sea levels. It's totally possible that that's the case. Like, but it's sort of like the principle of parsimony. Like, what would have to happen for all of that to be lost, and any domesticated animals associated with that to have gone extinct? It just seems pretty implausible that there'd be like literally almost no evidence of at this point. When it, as Dibble points out, there is so much evidence of hunter gatherers from that period. Like, it's everywhere. So if you had this civilization, it would have had to have been like very small, and like we must really be talking about like an elite transfer of technology, which again could be possible. And maybe that's why they didn't leave any of their DNA in the New World, and that sort of thing that would be you would expect to find, if that was the vector. But like I said, I mean, it's possible, and we should always be open minded to like new data arising that would contradict a previously held point. But it just seems pretty unlikely to me.
Yeah, that seems much less plausible. Graham Hancock reminds me a little bit of Alex Jones in the fact that they're both good communicators. They're both charismatic people, but they're kind of full of shit, and they will go several steps too far. Like, with Alex Jones, it's like, yeah, I agree. The Clintons are corrupt. That makes sense. But you went several steps too far when you say like
Right,
they're interdimensional lizard pedophiles or
right.
whatever, right? Because if to me the only thing, for the record, what I was saying is I think it's possible that, say, in Mesopotamia or Egypt, these civilizations are older than we thought they were.
Mhm.
That, at least to me, yeah, that makes sense. Or specifically, since you mentioned it, like in South America, because one of the many, many tragedies of what happened with European conquest is they burned all of the records that the Aztecs had They said, yeah, they weren't the ones who built it. There could have been, and again, that's not even, I feel like in a lot of ways, for even like mainstream historical framing, that's not a controversial thing. Like, so like the Assyrians, for example, there were at least two different iterations of the Assyrians and the Neo-Assyrians, who were like a different tribal people who took over that land and that civilization and those megalithic structures. So something like that seems at least plausible to me as a layman, or maybe somewhere like, that's coastal in like Asia or something like that. But it would have been a precursor to the existing civilizations that are in that region, not, Atlanteans or
Mhm.
Lemurians or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, I think in that my article that I wrote last week, I linked to a guy who's also on Substack who's pretty interesting. You should check him out. Andrew Cutler. He writes Vectors of Mind, and he has this theory about a hyperdiffusion theory about like a widespread transfer of similarities of culture all over the world. But it takes it further back in time, like maybe in 10,000 years, possibly before Hancock is talking about. And what that does is that allows you to use the established vectors for transmission, like the people who came into the Americas via the land bridge and Beringia could have spread this knowledge, and that's why there's a connection, which to me, that just seems a lot more plausible. If there is deeper connections between cultures, that seems like a way more likely route than like, this civilization that had boats and like all this high technology and we somehow have none of it. It's like, it's all possible. It all could, any of those things could be possible, but I think it's like, I just tend to lean towards the more simpler explanations because they tend to bear out more easily.
Yeah, I guess, it's just not as sexy, unfortunately. I think that's
Right.
kind of why,
Yeah.
Hancock is so popular. But I guess kind of related to that, something we're talking about, we kind of both touched on, that is, since we're both obviously like very passionate about history, there's a lot of other great people on Substack who write cool stuff about history. Do you think somebody, and I think you kind of said a little bit, it sounds like you think Graham Hancock is good for that history as a pursuit, but to play devil's advocate, um, on the other side of it, what I hear basically people saying is that he has just such bad methodology. He kind of encourages these very sensationalist narratives, as well as um, maybe kind of unnecessarily antagonistic towards, the quote unquote
Mhm.
mainstream historians. So where do you come out with that? Is it just good if people are interested in history, or kind of the other parallel that I would draw is historical movies, right? Because to me, I know, like, 300, the movie 300 by Zack Snyder, obviously
Mhm.
very inaccurate, but it's not trying to be inaccurate. Or sorry,
Right.
it's not trying to be accurate and present itself as real history. Whereas, say, the movie Alexander, which was trying to think of the guy who did that, that had Colin Farrell a couple years back. It's relatively historically accurate. It will like combine different historical figures into single characters for the purpose of a narrative, or like speed up the timeline so it makes sense for a movie, but it's still at its core all there. Whereas sometimes it feels like Graham Hancock falls more into the 300 category.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think Pratik Disgupta, he's another Substacker. He commented on my post the other day something I thought was accurate, that Hancock, he's exposing a lot of these sites that people didn't know much about, and because he's talking about them, now there's an interest in them, and it's like, that's good, that's positive. So I mean, I think that I wouldn't say that he's just like some villain or something like that. Like, I know some people do say that, and I think that's kind of ridiculous. And I think like, I do tend to fall more in the camp of like, any interest in history is probably good, because I think it's like people are going to get interested in it, and maybe like I did when I read that book, I was like, wow, this is far out. Hey, maybe I'll read another book, and then it's like you kind of, your understanding of it gets a little more mature and you learn more. So I think that's positive. I think that his main thing that bothers me is, like I said, like the kind of victim complex that he has, where he's like, oh, they're out to get me. It's this kind of like, I don't want to say paranoid, but it's just sort of like this conspiracy minded idea. Like, I really don't think that, mainstream archaeology, air quotes, like, um they probably want him to go away. They're probably irritated by him, but like I really don't think that they like they like stay up at night plotting on how to silence him or something like that, you know?
Yeah.
So that to me is a little counterproductive. And of course, they don't really help that perception either in the media when it's like all of these attacks on him that seem to get kind of personal and like, the whole thing about racism, white supremacy. Like we could get into that if you want, but it's like I think there's some merit to that, but I also think they go way too far with the accusation.
Yeah, I don't. Well, with that specifically, I don't get the impression that Graham Hancock himself is personally a racist or a white supremacist, or that, like, he's, I'm trying to think. He just like, oh yeah, I want to say that it was, this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans who
Right.
did all this. I do genuinely think that, like, he thinks he's doing good work, but I think, yeah, it's a good way to kind of discredit somebody, and he uses some source material that I think maybe kind of lends itself to that. Like, was it the Eric von Daniken guy, if you know him, who
Yeah, I
did
think I know the name. I think of Ignatius Donnelly,
he
the
was
Atlantis.
yeah, it's similar. He did I think it was Fingerprints of the Gods, which it was in a way I feel like it was
Well,
in
that
about
was
a
Hancock, unless there's another Fingerprints of
no
the God.
sorry, Chariots of the Gods, that's what I'm
Okay,
thinking, sorry.
gotcha.
um yeah, it was kind of like in the 2000s and early 2010s, the Ancient Aliens thing was
Gotcha.
very
Oh, yeah,
in vogue. And I mean, it's basically because it feels like a very similar thing that we've seen in pop culture and even, like, pop history going farther back, that you have, it's instead of an ancient civilization that were the Atlanteans, Lemurians. I don't know if Hancock ever specifically puts a point on that, but it was like, oh, it was just aliens who gave us the
right.
technology. So, and to me, that's like the culture war issue aside, what really bothers me is it's kind of very disempowering to humans. And I
Yeah,
think we're really
yeah,
smart because 2 points I want to make, and then I'll throw it back to you, is A, like, I think it's very easy. I know at least I did for a while, that with the bias of modernity, that you think, people were just, stupid, savages, ignorant up until, like, the age of reason and science. But people were, biologically modern for, I think, about 200,000 years, and they were just as smart as you and I are today, but they just didn't have the tools that we have. So they would do, say, alchemy or astronomy, stuff like that, and they had nothing else to do but try to figure out how to build these megalithic structures. Um, so, I mean, to me, it seems like kind of offensive to humanity and the human spirit, really. And kind of the other parallel that I draw, I don't know, this is maybe a little bit left field of what we're talking about. When I talk here about people, when we're trying to figure out where the origin of life itself on the Earth is, and there's the one of the main theories is that there was a comet that had life on it, it crashed on Earth. And to me, like, you're not really solving the question of the origin of life. You're just
right.
pushing it back just a little bit, much in the same way. It's like, okay, well, where did these, protogenic civilizations, well, where did they figure out that technology? Did they just kind of figure it out on their own? And if so, why couldn't, the Aztecs or the Egyptians or, the ancient Mycenaeans or whatever it is? So,
Yeah, yeah. It's like that's why prehistory is just so fascinating to me, right? It's just like you can keep unspooling the thread forever, and that's always interesting, right? Like you're saying, you can go back to a comet that maybe brought bacteria of life or whatever. It's just like it's endlessly compelling. It just gets to me. It'll never stop being fascinating. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that um, I'm trying to think of what your original question or point was before we started talking about the comet. But
I don't know if I had one.
okay,
Um, and if you had, I mean, jump into anything else, I guess I have some
yeah.
other questions, but I was just kind of
Oh, I
vamping, I
think
guess you could
we
say.
were kind of talking about like, yeah, like the oh yeah, the dignity of humans kind of thing. Like,
Mm.
yeah, that's my thing with it too. Like, it's like, yeah, I don't think Graham Hancock is racist, and I don't think it's really doing any good at all to like throw that accusation around. But I do think there is also like a long history of people who like other civilizations or cultures have considered primitive and unable to build things. And that
Yeah.
kind of comes through in some of his theories. Like even in the last episode, he talks about the on the island of Rapa Nui, the Moai statues there, and he sort of like discredits that they could have built them, which I found, I was like, if I was like,
Yeah.
I was from there, I'd be upset.
He
Like that's
does.
really,
Yeah, I was gonna. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just gonna say I've noticed he takes very specific care to talk to indigenous people all over the
mhm,
world, including like
yeah,
I've seen like stuff in Europe, but I don't know if he's. And again, I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that I don't think he's being cynical and just trying to use
yeah,
that as cover, but because also like some of these people they believe this too because it's their traditional legends and they want to have somebody
yeah,
who will give it some credence and take it seriously. But I do feel like the degree that you could call him really unscrupulous is like he asks very leading questions, and I feel like the way that it's edited, that he just he will leave in the parts that where they're which is pretty classic stuff, especially in journalism. Leave in the parts that back up what you're saying and leave out what doesn't. Which, as a small side note, it's so funny that they promoted it as like Keanu Reeves being involved, and I feel like there's
right,
maybe 15 minutes of him just like, yeah, that's crazy,
yeah.
and then they interspersed into the entire second season. But
Yeah,
um,
that was like a real head scratcher. I was sort of like, what? Because my wife only watched the parts that Keanu was in. She'd be like, "Is he
mhm,
on?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, Keanu's on. Come
mhm.
watch it." And she left for the rest of it. But it's like there are probably people who are like, "Dude, Keanu Reeves!" Like, but yeah, he didn't
Yeah.
really do anything except look really amazed. Which I mean, he's very good at that. So
Whoa.
yeah,
Yeah. But again, to like build on what you're saying, I do get where it's coming from because a lot of the times like I'll just listen to and if anybody who is listening who's ever been interested in if you're interested in history, it's such a great time. Just for there's just such a wealth of great content that's out there for free on YouTube. People put out like these great history documentaries, and maybe I'll make a master list and put them out there. But I'll put these on like when I'm working because I work and like what do you call it? Like a data center where I'm like walking around. It's cold. I'm like racking up all these switches and stuff. And I'll just listen to stuff. And so I remember a little while back I had a playlist of some of this what you were talking about, the prehistory stuff, and just with the way YouTube works and its algorithms and its suggested videos, it starts out very good and scientific. And I remember at one point though, there was one where it was like talking about Aryans and stuff. And I know like
right,
they've generally moved more towards Indo-European for those
right,
obvious connotations. And some of it's like, you are getting a little bit too close for with the race science stuff.
right.
I understand why people have the discomfort around it.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, when I started like reading a lot about genetics and ancient DNA, I was fascinated by it. But it's like I actually like like most of my friends and family are pretty liberal, progressive. So like,
Mhm.
and I am for the most part, but I'm kind of a heterodox kind of guy these days, I guess. But like, I still feel like when I talk about genetics, like people kind of side eye me because it's
It's
like,
a scary topic
yeah,
for obvious
right,
reasons. Yeah.
right. They're like, wait a minute, and I'm like, no, I'm talking about like it's like there's still baggage associated with that, and I think that
Mhm.
I don't know how long it takes for that to really. There's still like a lot of debates even among geneticists about like how appropriate is it to talk about certain things, and it's kind of interesting. But to me, I just always feel like science should be independent of that, but it doesn't seem
Yeah.
like
I
that's
know
very
what you
easy to do.
mean. I was reading a little while back, and because I'm so such a casual follower of this, I wish I could remember the names of the people in question. But there is uh, I think now like the unfortunately named theory of the Aryan invasion of
Right,
India, and like especially like Indian like nationalism is kind of its own wild thing. There's like a big move in like Indian nationalism to
right.
try to discredit that theory. Or I think now some people say it's like more of a migration, which
Mhm.
I don't know, which I get where it's coming from on one level, but at the same time, I would agree with you that let the science speak for itself. Because at least to me, to the degree that I've read about this stuff, it's more like, wow, this is so cool. We're more connected than I thought we are. We're more
Exactly.
the
Exactly.
same than we are different. That's so cool. Like,
Mhm.
the we are so many different words in various European languages or Iranian or Indian that are all the same. There's all this cool stuff. And that's again where Graham Hancock will touch on something that's true. You'll see similar things in religion or architecture and all these very different civilizations. And to me, that's a really, really cool thing. But obviously, like, you don't even need, you don't need to mention the Austrian painter to,
Right.
know why this stuff can get a little bit sore subjects for some people.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's like it wasn't just the Nazis. There's been plenty of
Mhm.
people who have abused like I really think there's a pretty strong connection between authoritarian movements on both the left and the right, and using ancient history to sort of like bolster your cause. Like, I mean, the Khmer Rouge did that with the Khmer Empire in Cambodia. The Nazis obviously did it with the corded ware, and there's just so many different like examples of that throughout history that I think people on the left are because of that are more skeptical, because they hear like, oh, someone's talking about like proto-indo-europeans, and isn't that close to the Asian theory, and don't aren't we supposed to be against that? But it's like, if like you say, if you really unpack those things, they do more to justify that we are all interconnected and have been constantly mixing with each other than there is some sort of like superior race, which to me, I don't take that at all from the science. I take it that it's like, we're a melting pot of different civilizations that have constantly been mixing with each other.
Yeah, well, that's generally the conclusion I draw as well, because just for example, the amount of migration that has happened. Like, a lot of people don't know that the people we think of the English now were not even they're like if I recall correctly, you'll probably know better than I do. There was like an original uh, you know indigenous people, and then we had the first Indo-European migration, and then around like the turn of the from BC to AD, we had the German migration. So like I think like the actual indigenous people of England are the Welsh, and like the people that we think of as British now, or like the German immigrants or the Norman invasions, or and that's just England, which is like the whitest of white, and there's so much migration and mixing there going back relatively recently. But I don't know, what do you think about that?
Can I unpack that a little further? That
Yeah, go
because I
ahead.
think you're basically correct. It's a little bit more complex than that, though, because of ancient DNA. This is all stuff that we're like learning in the last 10, 15 years. So I just think that's why it's so interesting. But there's a number of studies that were done by David Reich's laboratory in Harvard and others in the mid-teens that confirmed that Europeans, you and I, pretty European, I would imagine. I know I'm like almost 99% Northern European, but like our ancient past is the result of three distinct populations. And the first one was these they go back to basically the end of the Ice Age. The archaeologists call them the Western hunter-gatherers, and they had like a culture that was spread basically from the Balkans to the British Isles and down into um, towards the Mediterranean as well. And they actually like, it's controversial, but pretty likely that they were fairly dark-skinned people coming from more recently from Africa, and there's other explanations for that I won't get into. But that's one population. And then when agriculture spread, there was a huge migration of Anatolian, Near Eastern people who came from that region through Greece, and one of them, two groups basically split off. One went up through the Danube into Central Europe, and the other kind of island hopped around the Mediterranean and up into the British Isles. And they kind of converged around, I think it's around the third or fourth millennium BC. And they probably assimilated a lot of those Western hunter gatherers, although there were still a number of them left, sort of pushed to the marginal hunting and fishing areas. But that's when farming, spread all over Europe. And then the next big wave was the steppe migrations, who were people who had come from the Ukraine and Russia steppe lands, possibly on horseback. That's still debated, but they were like, this sort of patriarchal, warlike they were herders. They were sort of like the Mongols of their era, right? Like they were of the Eurasian steppe, that like sky father worshiping, like all the stereotypes. And the cliche is that they invaded Europe and killed all of the Neolithic people that were there. And the reason people think that now is because the DNA shift was so pronounced from the period that they start coming in the archaeological record. Those skeletons have a match in DNA showing a massive replacement of the male lineages, mostly, not the female, which would mean that they probably wiped out the males and took female brides among the Neolithic hunter-gatherers. And then by the time they made it to England, it was a 90% replacement of both the Western hunter-gatherers and the Anatolian farmers. And the people that are there now are like mostly steppe related. So, most Europeans, when you get into Southern Europe, it's a little bit more of the Neolithic farmer ancestry stayed. And I think that's reflected in the cultures of Greece that seem a little different from some of the other, Indo-European cultures. But I'm vastly oversimplifying it. It gets pretty complicated. But basically, it's like three distinct populations. And the last one was a massive replacement, although we can't say for sure that it was violent. It probably was. And then, like you said, the migration period around the Roman Empire shuffled it all around too, when you had like the Huns and the Goths and those Germanic people, and then the Gauls, and like there was just so much going on then too. So, but it's fascinating, right? Like that's just like, it's incredible that we can kind of like figure that out through, a mix of archaeology and DNA and linguistics. It's totally amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, God, I could talk about that for hours, because my understanding was just like you had the Saxons migrate in around that time, as well as like the Normans and the Vikings as well, who were like but it's again like so many, again, the linguistic stuff that's so fascinating to me, that even today, thousands of years later, like the reason we have beef and poultry are words for like the cooked food for chicken or cow, is because at the way back in time, the French were ruling over the English. So
Right.
the peasants would raise it, and the nobles would eat it. So, and again, that's the stuff that I find so interesting. I love reading about, and watching documentaries, what have you. So is there any like books you would recommend or sources, or is this just like too deep of a topic to, if somebody like me were just to want to get into it, what would you recommend?
I think a good starting point for like, and I feel like I'm kind of just like really like harping on the DNA thing, but I think it's pretty interesting. And there's a book that came out around 6 or 7 years ago by David Reich, who's one of the scientists who's responsible for all this research. He wrote a book called Who We Are and How We Got Here. And it's about the science of DNA, ancient DNA. And he goes through basically every culture of the world and goes back and maps out the genetic links that we're finding. And it's pretty readable. I mean, it's not less like a book. It's a popular science book. It's not a book that you really need to have a deep understanding of biology or genetics to read. But there's a lot of great history in there. I'd recommend that one.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've heard of that one now that you mention it. And that touches on another topic I wanted to ask you. Like, what do you think the line is as far as like popular history versus kids? There's a very big bifurcation between pop history. People like say Tom Holland, what's her face, Allison Weir, who I really like, who do good pop history stuff. And then you have podcasters, your Dan Carlins, your what's that guy who did history, Mike Duncan, people like that who are great. And then you have the very, very dry stuff. So like, do you think, obviously there is a line where you lose the layperson, but like what do you think, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, like what responsibility, if any, do you think like somebody who's a more pop historian, somebody who's just interested in entertaining or getting people interested in history, like how accurate do they have to be? How much can they leave out? How much can they do like Oliver Stone did with Alexander, where all right, let me speed up the timeline for a narrative. Let me combine a couple different figures, not literally necessarily, but figuratively. So where do you think that line is?
I mean, I think when it comes to movies, I don't know that I would say there's a line at all. I mean, you can make a movie about anything you want, right? Like there's tons of stuff now that like the Vikings show on Netflix. Like, you know, I watched the first season of it when it came out, like, 10 years ago or whatever. And I was like, yeah, this is okay. Like, I really love Vikings. I was into it for a little bit, but I didn't think it was like a super great show. And it's like every season kind of got more and more weird and out there. And then like the one they most recently did is just like completely historically inaccurate. And, obviously like people are like, it's like woke history because they made like a black woman, the, Viking leader. And eh,
Yeah,
that didn't
it
happen.
takes me out of it a little bit, to be honest. But
Yeah, I know. And it's like, but I mean, at the same time, if they want to make that show, they can make that show, right? It's
yeah,
like, I don't really know that, but I see what you're saying. It's just sort of like, I guess I would say if I'm a consumer of a movie, I think I personally go into it just being like, hey, if I'm watching a historical thing, I can suspend my disbelief a little bit and enjoy the movie if it's good. But if it's not, I'm just going to sit there and pick it apart and be like, this is stupid.
yeah. Well, it kind of reminds me of like the black female Jarl, but it makes me think of
Right.
John Wayne being Genghis Khan. It's like
Right.
part of it's like
Right.
turnabout's fair play,
Yeah.
but if you're not even trying to be historically accurate, part of it's like it's hard to get mad. But I think another example I remember, I don't know if you remember this, like it was like a decade ago on Netflix. They did a Marco Polo show, which to me such a wasted opportunity because it's such a good story to tell and such a good framing device. But they just tried to make it Game of Thrones, and that's
Right.
kind of the impression that I got with the Vikings show. Like everything, they're trying to make it Game of Thrones rather than actual history.
Yeah, and I think it's like I'm a big fan of Game of Thrones. I love the books.
Mhm.
The show obviously I have a lot of issues with it, including the spinoffs. But like, I loved the series. Like, I just thought the way he like blended history into it to create like an alternate world that like is not Earth, that is has all these obvious parallels to Earth.
Because it's the
cool,
War of
right?
the Roses, right?
Right.
Basically.
Among other things. Then he throws in like, the wall is kind of like Hadrian's Wall in
Mhm.
Scotland and England, like, the savages on the other side and the Romans. There's all kinds of allusions to like European history. And Tolkien did the same thing, and like, I mean, I know a lot of people say Tolkien was sort of like actually creating like a mythology of prehistoric Europe, which he was explicit about. But like, I'm not a Tolkien expert. Also, a huge fan. I know you are too of
Mhm.
that work. I just think Tolkien is just incredible. Like, just a great writer, and I grew up with those stories and I love them. But I like that he like kind of he's making a work of fiction about the past, but it's not, he was never saying this is history, it's like,
Mhm.
this is a
Yes,
story, right?
self-conscious
Yeah,
mythology because it was
right.
all the
Mhm.
pre-Christian stuff was lost, and because I know that's what is his name? The Conan the Barbarian guy. It's my mind. Robert E. Howard
Robert
did. He
Howard.
was trying to do the same thing where you're taking
Yeah.
these prehistoric things and blending myth and history, which I think is really interesting narratively. But it's not meant to be taken seriously as real history. But
Yeah, I think I love the Howard books. It's been a long time since I read any of them, but like, I think originally his thing was that he was like, I want to write like a prehistoric epic, but I don't have time to research all of these cultures.
mhm,
So I'm going to set it far enough back in the past that it's like, you don't need to be totally accurate. And he did a great job of that, right? Like,
mhm,
his world building is like, it's like sort of like it could be prehistoric Europe, but it's like,
mhm.
it's enough of its like its own thing that you can basically do whatever you want, which I think is a great formula for a fantasy writer,
Which also, and if you want to, I don't think this is actually true, but I think there is a little bit of something to it where, and if we're talking, because we're talking about the way that history gets diffused, and there's the old adage of the victors will write history,
Yeah.
and the trying, and I'm sure you probably know, but for the audience who doesn't, like different cultures, ancient cultures will have completely different attitudes towards recording history, where say the Romans were super meticulous, or the Egyptians were much more meticulous. Basically, all of say like the Persians, it writes like it reads like a press conference of like, yeah, I destroyed my enemies and smote them below me.
Right.
So think
Yeah.
about literally like 5,000 years of history. So like what actually happened in some cases, like there's basically no way of knowing. Not to say that Conan the Barbarian was real, but also
Right.
like I think you have to take history with a grain of salt, which is, if we're going to loop it back to the original topic, maybe why I think Graham Hancock has some purchase, because you'll see historians who get so very caught up in their own pet theories or what the conventional history is, only to be, there's a new discovery that comes out that just completely blows it out of the water.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, like just like we've been talking about, like, before, prior to 2010, people thought humans and Neanderthals could not interbreed, right? And that Neanderthals were like just a extinct separate branch of the human lineage, that we just wiped them out or whatever. That may be true. We may have wiped them out, but at least now we know that all of us have some Neanderthal blood in us. So it's like, we didn't know that. That changed the way we thought about it. And there could be a discovery in the next 10 years that is even more groundbreaking than that. It's totally possible,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the South America specifically is the one. I feel if there's anything that's going to happen, it'll be South America.
Yeah. Yeah, the Americas are very interesting because, and I think that's why Hancock chose to focus on that for this season, because that is an area, and he points to this all the time. It's like the Clovis first hypothesis, where people are like, for a long time, it's just like, case closed, humans crossed the land bridge, the glacier path that they could have gone down through the Rocky Mountains that wasn't open until 13,000 years ago. So there's no way humans could have got here. That's it. We know the answer. Everything happened after that. And now it's certainly not pseudoscience science to suggest that that's just wrong. Like, we know that's wrong. Like, there's more and more evidence that humans were on the continent way before that. Probably not large groups of them, though. So that's another thing. Yeah, it's maybe a feather in his cap. Like, that's going to kind of keep giving his argument life, right? Like, well, maybe that's his elite group, but we just don't know. It's very, and I think I would love to find out more, have more evidence, more, footprints or, remains come through. I mean, that's just super, like, I'd get super excited about that. And I think archaeologists would too. So we just have to see what happens, So
yeah, which is one of my main problems with Graham Hancock, is because that he has this very adversarial relationship, and he, like you said, he has this persecution complex. He thinks, oh, they don't want anybody to find out, which is something that, like, Flint Dibble brought up. That on one level, like, I get where Hancock is coming from, because I'm not a historian, not a researcher, but I do, I work in the tech field now, and I work around engineers, and I've definitely, I think it's the same personality type. I've definitely seen people who are totally wrong, who just get really, really invested in their own theory and their own, their ego is totally invested in it. So on one level, I could see where he's coming from when Graham Hancock says, people are just very resistant to new theories. But that having been said, that's the thing I did agree with Dibble on, is like, I think usually, like, historians are guys like us, where you love this stuff, you find it fascinating, and you want to find out more about it. You're not like, oh, we must keep the secret knowledge to ourselves and not let the peasants know,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's like, what, there are people in academia who like have this vested interest in protecting their theories because of their egos, right? Of course we know that. Like, I'm sure there are plenty of PhDs in, anthropology, archaeology who are not welcoming to things that would disprove their theories. But I'm not in academia. I don't know the politics of that, but I could see it, right? And but at the same time, yeah, I think for the most part, like, most of them are people who really believe in, the pursuit of knowledge, and they just don't really see the evidence coming from him, and it rubs them the wrong way, because that's their whole thing, is like, you need to prove your point, you need to get peer reviewed, and he hasn't done that. So it's like,
also he's getting so much more attention and way more funding, because that's the thing I was thinking the other day, is like, damn, it seems like it'd be pretty sweet to be Graham Hancock. You get to travel all over the world and see all the. I mean, he's like, I haven't watched. I think he might have said he stopped, but it seems like he's like a big stoner and doing ayahuasca and stuff. Like, it's got to be awesome. I bet you'd be a little bit jealous of Graham Hancock if you're Flint Dibble.
I'm jealous of Graham Hancock. Are you kidding, man?
Hell yeah, I would love to be that.
Yeah.
So on that note, I have a couple more questions for you. And I'll I'll let you go. I don't want to take up much more of your time. So, kind of related to what we were just talking about, just as like a fan of history, especially like the genetic side of it. If there were to be like, do you think that there's any like really underrated topic or little known fact that you think would, the average person doesn't know that you think would be they would like to know or would be good to know? Is there anything that, or maybe a misconception that a lot of people have?
Hmm. Oh God, I mean, it's hard to pick one. There's just so many things. Like, you mean like kind of like more related to the Hancock sphere of things, or
Just in
just
general,
generally?
like with any, like, it could be any of your historical passions,
Yeah.
specifically the genetic thing, because already,
Mhm.
like, I mentioned, I knew very broadly, I thought it was basically like three genetic groups, but it sounds like it was like eight that went to England alone. So just
Right.
that, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that's super interesting. It's like, um, and I think we talked about this a little earlier. There's so much misuse of that type of science in popular representations, like, you know the Aryan race, right? Like, it's like, what is that? Like, is it a prison gang? Is it what the fuck is it, right? It's
Hmm.
like, but that word it has a very specific meaning, and it means, it comes out of the Indo-Aryan tradition, which is like, basically, in terms of the Proto-Indo-European expansion that's thought of, it's the around, the beginning of the Bronze Age in the Eurasian steppe. There was this massive, like, out migration from the steppes of these pastoralists. One group went east, and then one group kind of followed them. Or I'm sorry, one group went west into Europe, and one group kind of went along up into Russia, and then for some reason just like headed out the other way. Maybe they got in a fight with the other group of pastoralists and got banished and went out east, but they went all the way to the Ural Mountains, like out way the hell out in Russia. And then they went south, and then they met around the Caspian Sea. They met this settled agricultural complex called the Bactria Marjania agricultural complex. They call it the BMAC. But these people, by the time they got there, these pastoralists from the steppe, they were known as the Andronovo culture, I believe. I hope I'm getting that right. And the culture before them was the Santashta culture. And if this is getting too in the weeds, like, let me just say that these are the people who probably invented the chariot and were the people who were probably most likely responsible for domesticating horses, at least the widespread version. So you can imagine these pastoralists from the steppe in horse-drawn chariots, just like total badasses, get into this agricultural civilization. And around this time, that's the Aryan identity starts to come about, and basically it's referring to, and again, I'm kind of like oversimplifying here, but the people who would go on to write the Rig Veda in the beginning of the Indic religions, and it all kind of like germinated there around the Caspian Sea, and this blending of the steppe cultures and the agriculturalists, who then formed the Vedic tradition that went into India and then further into Iran, Pakistan, like all over. And but if you read the Rig Veda, there's this drink called soma. That soma is like a god, but it's also this drink that they drink. And a lot of people think it may have been some sort of hallucinogen, or maybe it was just like a sort of like a type of speed or something. There's lots of theories, but I'll wind up my long-winded story here by saying that it's like those people basically are the Aryans. It's like the people, like the word Iran comes from Aryan, the same root. It's an old, like, Indo-European, Indo-Aryan tradition, but it's very specific to the people of like Iran, Pakistan, and India, not German fascists, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
that's the interesting thing. It's just totally fascinating, and I think that's amazing, right? Like the stories that you can imagine of these pastoralists invading this place, whether it was violent or not, and then like getting high together and then coming up with this crazy religion and going like deeper into Asia. Amazing, right? It's just totally
Yeah.
fascinating.
That's it's definitely super interesting. I appreciate it. Makes me want to read a lot more about it, and I guess that's where the true scholarship has to come in, because I would imagine these people didn't have a written language when all this was happening.
Well, that's the thing, is that it was oral tradition that probably is very similar coming out of that Eurasian steppe. So there's a link between the Iliad, that was composed in the, around the the Greek Dark Age, like 3,000 years ago, and the Rig Veda, there's lots of similarities there. Like there's something that I was listening to this podcast recently where they're talking about how in the Rig Veda there's something about not having sex during the day, and apparently that's in the Iliad too. So there's like,
Hmm.
even though these cultures are very separated, there's this older tradition that probably developed on the steppe, and maybe there's some prohibition against daytime sex, which is really weird, but that's
Yeah.
fascinating, right? Like there's just all these, like it points to an older oral tradition that didn't get composed. The Rig Veda was composed probably in the second millennium BC, so it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, written recording of an Indo-European language is the Rig Veda, and it's really great. If people want to read it, it's cool. Just get a copy, and it's just a book of their sacrificial rites and sort of like the way they looked at their gods, and it's really neat. You can just read these prayers of people from like 3,000, 3,500 years ago, and I think that's just incredible that we have that. So cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's some fascinating stuff. I guess that's probably a good note to end it on. Before I have my main final sign-off question, do you have anything coming up? Any pieces that you're releasing soon that you want to promote, or just your blog in general? You want to shout that out again, or anything else like that?
Yeah, it's Garden of Shanidar, which is that's my Substack. I put a piece out last week that is sort of like a lot of the things that PJ and I are talking about today. I wrote about in that article about Hancock and hyperdiffusion. So I would encourage people to read that if they want to know more about my thoughts on that stuff. And I have other things on there. At the moment, yeah, I'm just going to keep plugging away, writing when I can, and yeah, just trying to fit that in wherever I can.
And how that is. Yeah, the other one I would like to shout out for the audience, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing this right, the piece you wrote called Ghosty was one of my favorite things I've written on Substack, where you kind of fuse together like all this like, proto-European, like Bronze Age history stuff with like your life and like hitchhiking and stuff. That was so cool. I really, really loved that one.
Thank you. Actually, that's one of the ones I'm most proud of. So I'm glad that you enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, I think you described like a trucker as like, a Bronze Age chieftain or something. So that one I would say anybody go check that one. Go subscribe to James if you're not already. So my final question I always have for a guest is, because the world is a little bit doom and gloom right now. We didn't touch on it, but for those of us in the U.S., yeah, we're a couple days away from a U.S. presidential election, and it's going to get probably more hairy after it's completed. So that having been said, what, if anything, makes you hopeful for the future, or what would you like to see that would make you hopeful for the future?
I don't know, man. I mean, I'm kind of a doom and gloomer in a lot of ways, but I'm you got to be optimistic, right? You have to. Like, it's just like I have to think that that we're gonna keep being humans and doing what humans do, which has always included really fucked up shit and probably a lot of violence. And of course, I don't want to see that happen here or anywhere else. Like, I really don't. Like, I think that I want to see us live together and just like realize our commonalities. I know that sounds like a trite, cliched thing to say, but I guess like what I'm trying to say is that the more I read of history, the more I understand that like what we're going through now is really not that new. It's like we've always been fighting, we've always been fucked up, but we've also always done really fucking awesome things. And I think we're going to continue to do that in balance with the terrible things. And I just hope it keeps going. And I just hope that we can continue to live together. That's my big thing.
Yeah, well, that's a great note to sign off on. So, James, I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate everybody listening. So, have a good one. I really appreciate you, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Anytime.